So I just finished watching Reminiscence on HBO Max, and I got to say, I thought the movie was pretty neat. I liked the visuals in the film, I liked its story, I thought the acting was very good, and I liked the messages that it put inside of the film about personalities, figuring out the truth, and how to trust people even though you feel like they're leading onwards towards a dark path. And I was very surprised to see that it actually had a 36% on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, I understand that there are flaws within this movie, I'm not gonna lie about that, but I was really curious why a lot of people were downgrading the movie so hard. So this is me going out onto Rotten Tomatoes and once again talking about all of the negative reviews that are on that website. So this is the critics' consensus on Rotten Tomatoes so far. Although Reminiscence isn't lacking narrative ambition, its uncertain blend of sci-fi action and noir thriller mostly provokes memories of better films. I also wanted to bring in some clarity of how this video is going to work. There may be some spots where I'm not necessarily going to review every single negative review that is on this website if it's talking about the exact same thing and the exact same problems, why they had a problem with the movie. I also want you guys to be aware that I'm not going to read the full review that are suggested on the website. I'm only going to read the brief summaries that they had. Now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. It wants to be Chinatown meets Blade Runner, but it has the worst dialogue I've heard in a film in forever. After a strong start, the plot begins going in multiple directions, never setting on any specific tone. At times, I just wanted to yell at the screen, telling the film to pick a lane and stay in it. A sad combination of Inception, Blade Runner, but it lacks the finer parts that made both of those movies good. Reminiscence had a thought-provoking story it could have explored in its back pocket, but instead chose the dull route while keeping the climate change one merely as a backdrop. I'm curious why this one has an 80 out of 100. Doesn't that mean that it's supposed to be good? Okay, first let's talk about the dialogue. The dialogue, I will understand, it gets pretty sappy, and sometimes it does feel like that these people shouldn't be talking the way they are supposed to be talking, but it doesn't go so far off to the point where it's incredibly unbelievable. There are certain characters that have a knowledge with this type of technology that they're in, and also there are characters that have been through certain situations where you would see them talking like this specifically. Now, in terms of the romance, it does get pretty mushy, especially at the end, which is why I think that this movie could have been better as a television show. That way the relationship could actually be expanded to be a lot better. But for what it was, I didn't have a huge problem the way that these characters were talking in the film. I found some of it to be profound and some of the monologues in here to actually be very interesting to look into. And even though some of the dialogue was a little sappy, it wasn't all that bad. That probably goes the same with the story. If the story was expanded like it would have been on a television show, then people would have appreciated a lot more of what this movie would have been. Because this was created in a film, they had to pack in a lot of things so tightly that they had to do the best they can to actually have you care for these characters, have people understand what's going on, how to tie it all in at the end of the movie, and have you understand everybody's ambitions and motivations of where they come from and why they're doing what they're doing. And finally, the last bit about saying that it's acting like Blade Runner and Inception, but it's transforming itself into a dull movie. I love that it is honoring both Inception and Blade Runner, but I don't think that this movie is actually dull. It's more of a psychological analysis of characters and what they truly are deep inside, which to me could be understood a lot more deeper if this movie had multiple rewatches. A cautionary tale about getting mired in the past is itself hamstrung by what has come before. Overplayed noir tropes and underbaked sci-fi ideas, the fab cast at least elevates this to the mediocre. Reminiscence is a grandiose sci-fi blockbuster that looks great, sounds deafening, but ultimately disappoints because it's a genre sampler that can't find a distinctive voice of its own. Although initially intriguing and always beautiful to look at, Westworld production designer Howard Cummings and his team are the real stars here. Reminiscence just doesn't have the goods in terms of tension or pace. Now that's an interesting one. Can something like this, in terms of its style, be overdone that you're not necessarily that intrigued by it? It could, if that type of style is more so reliant on covering up some of the problems that are inside of the film, and the problems are the things that the viewer would want to look at and would find to be the more interesting part of the film to them, then that would be understanding. Some people would probably get tired of seeing something that's visually good looking, and that would win over the audience members and would claim to say that the film is good no matter what kind of flaws it has inside of it. But to me, if you can create a good story even through the nice visuals that it's presented with, then I would say that it's still good within its own merits, not because it's over-reliant on its stylistic visuals, but it's also telling a good story at the exact same time. It's a common thing that people usually have a problem with, style over substance, and if you don't have enough substance in order for you to be intrigued in the movie, then you're not necessarily going to enjoy it. Futuristic film noir Reminiscence from Westworld executive producer fails to come together. Jackman and Ferguson have no chemistry, some memories better left forgotten. Reminiscence is the damnedest thing. A movie filled with promising concepts it doesn't get around to exploring because it's dedicated to a romantic mystery that's never very romantic or mysterious. What hurts the most is you can see all the wasted potential, a good idea, a solid director, and a talented cast that never kicks into gear. The execution part I do understand, like everything that has come together looks like that is going to be good, and the idea here I really do like. The visuals are great and the acting and the casting here is great, but it doesn't necessarily work for some people because they would prefer it to be executed in a different fashion, which is the television one. Now, about the romance comment, I don't think that some people are able to understand what this movie is trying to get at. Now, the chemistry, yeah, there probably should have been a lot more better chemistry in the film, but I don't think that's what the movie is intended to focus on. It's intended to focus on different personalities and the analysis of other characters that have happened in the film. It's about understanding the two main leads and where they came from, not the chemistry itself. It's about understanding who they truly are and understanding the deep themes and morals it has inside the film, and I would find that to be intense and interesting. Does this movie have romance? Does it have some mushy scenes in it? Sure, yeah, it does, but it's not as mushy as you think it is. It's pretty dark, and it goes to some deep territories in order for you to figure out the nature of these characters. Reminiscence is an unintelligible mess. I don't think it's unintelligible, I think it's actually pretty clever. It's more than a bit disappointing to watch as Joy's initial world building and establishment of tone become diminished. What we have here is a science fiction time travel private eye investigation procedural film noir love story. You ain't wrong about that. Derivativeness is not the problem. All these stories stem from somewhere, but the lack of imagination coupled with the film's deadly earnest tone is another matter entirely. The comment about derivativeness is more so subjective than objective. I can understand when some people who have seen stuff like this before, when they've watched movies in the past, or maybe movies that are in the present as well, they don't find the movie to be that interesting because they have seen these kind of stories before and it's not necessarily doing anything particularly new with it. But I don't think that this movie is doing something old. It actually finds itself around to do something different while also being honorable to other movies that also have been called good in their time. For me, I think it depends on how much you enjoy movies like this or how tired you are on seeing movies that are acting like this. If you want to see something that is fully brand new, fully different, and something that you haven't seen before, something that was a little bit more with originality, then this movie would not be for you. But if you want to see something that is kind of like those past movies that have been called great, and do something that's tweaked up a little bit different to make it somewhat intriguing, then I think that you're going to enjoy this movie fine. An incomprehensible mess and waste of time, sci-fi that needs much more editing of purpose and clarity in the fog of its weird story. Rebecca Ferguson seems lost, for example. I think I can understand what he's talking about when it comes to Rebecca Ferguson's acting, but I think that is a part of what her character is supposed to be like, and I think she does a good job at acting as that character. It's visually inviting, but as flimsy as a paper doll in its themes. Although Reminiscence doesn't try to hide any inherent metaphors, it doesn't do much with the material besides fashion something like a dull-edged Blade Runner. Reminiscence moves at a snail's pace. Huge chunks of the film is like watching molelessness drip backwards in slow motion. I'm seeing a lot of quotes talking about how this is basically a ripoff of Blade Runner, or how it's trying to act like Blade Runner, but there's nothing underneath it. But here's a little bit of a hot take. I think that this movie does it better than Blade Runner. Blade Runner has a cool concept and an idea on what it's trying to do, but it's so overly reliant on that message and idea that it's not necessarily taking care of its characters and have us watch an interesting story that they're going through. While Reminiscence is actually taking homage to that sci-fi location, it's actually wanting to do a psychological analysis of the characters and talk about a story that is about the characters at the exact same time. We're with these characters, we're feeling these characters, we're able to understand what these characters are going through, but it would have been a lot more justified and more understood if it was done, like, once again, as a television show. But I felt like with its purpose, it did a lot more better job at explaining and understanding what these characters are like and what they're going through than the Blade Runner movie did. For a project with the potential to combine the likes of Inception and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Reminiscence instead offers joyless, forgettable nonsense. And again, I like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and Inception. Why is it that when people are quoting other good movies and then putting it on this, they're saying that this movie is crap because it's acting like those other movies? Other movies always get recycled by other movies. There isn't necessarily a such thing as originality, and sometimes when you are trying to be original, they're the ones that are usually getting very divisive, and sometimes people would say that those movies are not necessarily that good, even though they're technically original. With the star power here and the dystopian setting, Reminiscence should have been a surefire home run. But I had my worries. The villains are one-dimensional, the story runs like a bad detective piece, with cheap romance and melodrama laced throughout. A classic August movie, a high-priced all-star dud dumped in cinema's slowest month and forgotten by Labor Day. Jeez, harsh. I admired the ambition, but it felt very repetitive and didn't have the emotional oomph for it to work. It won't be immediately forgotten, but rather forever known as the time WB gave the co-creator of Westworld a bunch of money to make a colossal misfire. That's another thing that people like to point out. They kind of like the ambition of the film, but they just can't seem to get a grasp on the characters or the story that's at hand. I think that some of the choices that these people do make it as tight as they possibly could in order for me to understand what kind of movie that it was wanting to do and have me to actually go through these characters' journeys. Maybe if I go on rewatch, I would probably have my likability factors on this film lowered down a bit more. But as of right now, I don't think that what this movie presented to me was all that bad in terms of the way that it was executed. It definitely could have been better, but I don't think that it was bad for what it was. Incentive and ambitious, but wildly convoluted and ultimately disappointing. You have to really buy into some shared connections if you want to be motivated by where all of this is going. There is just too much float sim and jet sim in this waterlogged effort, drowning the film's better aspects. The sad irony of Reminiscence is that it will soon be forgotten. When Joy lets us peek in these tiny, intriguing corners of her speculative world, Reminiscence comes alive the most. Otherwise, the rest of it fades like a memory you just as soon forget. And I've seen this quote put out on Rotten Tomatoes a lot, the soon will be forgotten quote in here. But is this movie forgettable though? I think it just depends on how long you're willing to be there for the journey or how curious you are to see where this movie is going to go. I feel like that all of the lessons that are tied into the movie and how the story is being told through a visual lens and how it's telling it through the psychological analysis of understanding the characters, it makes sense to me. But some people don't necessarily find that to be interesting, or some people would probably felt like that it would be interesting, but they would prefer it to go towards a different route, or they would prefer it to be executed in a different fashion. I don't think the problem this movie has is that it's forgettable. I think the problem that this movie has is that it is doing certain things, but it doesn't know how to do it in order to please its target audience, or at least everyone that's inside that target audience. I felt like that I was one of those target audience that would have been pleased by this movie and understood what it was going for, and I liked it enough for what it was. But maybe it's because I understood something behind the curtain. And some people probably don't feel the need to look behind the curtain. They probably just want to see the film for what it was, and for what it wasn't necessarily good enough for them. And that right there is understanding to me. And that's literally it. A lot of the same things are being said on Rotten Tomatoes about how this movie is forgettable and being exactly like Blade Runner, and there's also some other quotes about how this movie is just a slog-paced film. It's kind of saying the exact same stuff over and over again, but I try to get as much as I could of all the different things that I've heard from the negative reviews that are from Rotten Tomatoes. What did you guys think of the movie Reminiscence? Do you actually agree with what I say and you like it, or do you agree with what the critics say and you dislike the film? Put your thoughts down in the comment section below and let's have a conversation about it. And like this video if you agree with what I say, or dislike this video if you disagree with what I say. I don't mind the dislikes. So that is it I have for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be sure to see you in the next video.